Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagula. So another massive US economic package, President Biden calling it a once-in-a-generation investment plan, a $2.3 trillion overhaul of America's road, rail and power infrastructure. Mr. Biden described it as the largest investment in American jobs since the Second World War, a wide-ranging plan to reshape the world's biggest economy and leave it better placed to compete with China for the industries of the future. Beyond the upgrade to America's traditional infrastructure, which will in itself create millions of jobs, there's also the investment in non-traditional infrastructure, electric cars, high-speed internet, manufacturing hubs, green energy, etc. So a massively ambitious plan that also includes building a nationwide network of electric vehicle charging stations, bolstering America's national grid and revamping its drinking water systems.
We have to move now, because I'm convinced that if we act now, in 50 years, people are going to look back and say, this was the moment that America won the future. What I'm proposing is a one-time capital investment of roughly $2 trillion in America's future, spread largely over 8 years. It will generate historic job growth, historic economic growth, help businesses to compete internationally, create more revenue as well. Failing to make these investments adds to our debt and effectively puts our children at a disadvantage relative to our competitors. That's what crumbling infrastructure does. And our infrastructure is crumbling. We rank 13th in the world. What's more, it heightens our vulnerability to and attracts our adversaries to compete in ways that they haven't up to now. And our adversaries are worried about us building this critical infrastructure. We're going to raise the corporate tax. It was 35%, which is too high. We all agreed 5 years ago it should go down to 28%, but they reduced it to 21%. We're going to raise it back to up to 28%. No one should be able to complain about that. It's still lower than what that rate was between World War II and 2017. Just doing that one thing will generate $1 trillion in additional revenue over 15 years. All this adds up to more than what I proposed to spend in just 15 years. It's honest, it's fiscally responsible, and by the way, as the experts will tell you, it reduces the debt, the federal debt over the long haul. We have to move now, because I'm convinced that if we act now,
And that's Joe Biden presenting his new economic plan. Well, for Republican reaction to Mr. Biden's investment plan, I'm joined now from Columbia, South Carolina by Richard T. Hines, President and CEO of RTH Consulting. And Mr. Hines is one of the Republican operators who helped Donald Trump run his 2016 campaign at all levels and is considered to be a Trump loyalist. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Hines. And I expect that controversy is boiling in the US over Mr. Biden's $2 trillion economic package, especially in Republican ranks. I mean, what's your reaction to that package?
Well, I think that I've got to congratulate the president, and I think most Republicans do, on the idea of going with a big bill on infrastructure. I mean, his premise is correct. We have a crumbling infrastructure. We need to do something about it. That was the one point in the last Trump administration that you had bipartisan consensus on, is we need to do something about the Trump's proposals on the infrastructure broke down because they didn't have bipartisan support. And the danger here is the same development may keep Biden from going forward with this plan.
Okay, well, that's a bit of a
infrastructure bill.
surprise because I know you've always
Yeah.
been sort of vehemently opposed to a lot of those things. But what do you see? What do you actually say to those who consider this to be unqualified good news for the U.S. economy, not only in terms of infrastructure upgrade, but the creation of millions of jobs potentially? Especially for an economy that's still stuttering in the wake of the pandemic. Your point is that you're pretty happy with it.
The idea there is well, no, I'm happy with the infrastructure part of it. You've got to remember, out of $2.3 trillion, only 620 billion is hardcore infrastructure. The rest of it is sort of amorphous, home care. The question on reviving the economy comes down to what's your philosophy? Does a free market drive the economy, or does the government drive the economy? America has been successful economically because we've always believed in the free market. We believe if you want to promote electric cars, you go to Tesla. You don't go to the government to promote electric cars. There's some significant things. I used to be in an agency called the General Services Administration, and we bought cars. Well, this a somewhat more modest approach is you can buy electric cars for the U.S. government. That works. The idea of taking over an industry or deciding that you're going to go with windmills over traditional energy sources, which is a big part of this bill, that's very questionable. I mean, we just had a big problem. One of our largest states during a winter storm, these big windmills did not work. And when you do an analysis of this sort of alternative energy, you find that the people that really make money in this are the people that manufacture the windmills. Most of them are Chinese. So the devil is in the details. I don't think Republicans something immediately, and the president's timing is impeccable. We've got to address the infrastructure program. But if he doesn't do it in a way, it won't be successful. And I'm not the only one saying that. Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Democrat, has said the same thing. He holds the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. And if he doesn't get a bipartisan consensus on the infrastructure, he's not going to support the Biden plan. He said that yesterday. So there you go.
And just to bring in your old chum there into the discussion, I mean, the plan is to pay for this by reversing the corporate tax cuts that were passed by Donald Trump and closing loopholes that allow American companies to move profits abroad. I mean, the Trump administration, of course, argued that cutting taxes would encourage businesses to expand. But what happened, in terms of what happened in fact was that most of those benefits went to the wealthiest Americans, didn't it?
Well, sure. But if you're a Republican anyway, you don't think being a wealthy American is a bad thing, because wealthy Americans are those that create the jobs. We create the corporations, create the businesses, and that's what creates employment. The government doesn't do this. So we've seen Reagan, Bush era, and then the Trump administration, that cutting taxes drives the economy, not more taxes.
Right, but I mean, if you're talking about infrastructure development, then obviously you've got to pay for it from somewhere. And I mean, but what I wanted to get your assessments though, when you add this $2.3 trillion economic package to the recent coronavirus $1.9 trillion relief package, this will give the US federal government a much bigger role in the American economy than it's had in generations, won't it? I mean, what's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction is generally a negative one. If you stick to infrastructure, if you devote that money to infrastructure, which is a genuine function of government, then you're fine. When you get into picking placing bets on electric cars versus traditional gasoline-powered cars, then you're really lost. You're talking about increasing taxes for government experiments, and that generally doesn't work.
Right. But of course, beyond the headline grabbing sort of announcement, it has to pass Congress. And I understand, well, clearly listening to you and listening to other Republicans, they don't like it one little bit. What is your assessment? What are the challenges in Congress going to be like?
Well, you're not going to pass it, and you're not going to have just Republicans opposing it if you don't limit it to infrastructure. If you start part of the economy over another, and I will say, I think Biden's initiative is to be applauded. I think his timing is good, but he made the announcement at a union gathering. Well, my part of the country, which is the more prosperous part of the country, the South and the Southwest, labor is mostly non-union. So you're going to have to spread the benefits of infrastructure development over the whole labor market, not just one sector of the labor market. So the devil is in the details here. I think the Congress will probably get together and pass an infrastructure bill, but it will be considerably different from the one that President Biden has proposed.
But is it one of those things where you see the Democrats going it alone, as they did with that COVID relief package?
I think that's their first card, and if they're not successful, they'll back up and negotiate, come out with a bipartisan bill. That'd be my guess.
And of course, the question, as I said, being asked by not just Republicans, but by many Americans, is how this is going to be paid for, which, as we know, they've talked about increasing corporate taxes. I mean, what's your sense of the reaction to this amongst sort of ordinary Americans? I mean, I would imagine that that's something they welcome, because, I mean, you're talking about millions of jobs and taking America into the future.
Well, they like the idea of infrastructure redevelopment because he's absolutely, the analysis of the problem, nobody can deny it. It's true. We've got a crumbling infrastructure, we've got to address it. What is not understood by the Democrats is the fact if you go and increase corporate taxes, they trickle down to the average citizen. So it costs the average American more to buy food, more to buy cars. And there's no such thing in that sense as a corporate tax. It doesn't fall on one sector versus the other because the corporations, Walmart, you name it, they trickle it down to the consumer. And that's the balance we need to be careful of.
And are you bothered about the impact this might have on America's ballooning deficit?
The deficit is a problem. If you diminish the value of the dollar, you may be making more dollars, but the value is not, the purchasing power is diminished. Some people say that the current stock market is sort of artificial. In other words, that stocks have sought their real value, even though they're higher in dollars, the actual value is about the same as they were 6 months ago. So
okay, I have to. I'm going to come in there, Mr.
Yeah.
Hines, because I have to apologize to our viewers as well. Your internet line has not been brilliant, which perhaps says something about what Joe Biden is planning to do, which is upgrade the internet line so you've got stronger, faster internet. Interestingly, the other person who's coming on, who's Democrat, seems to have a better line than you. But thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hines, for joining us. And Richard Hines is President and CEO of RTH Consulting, and he is, of course, a Republican. You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about President Biden's latest massive economic investment plan. We'll hear from a Democrat. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegulu. Now, as you've probably heard by now, President Biden has put forward a $2 trillion plan to upgrade American infrastructure. He described it as a once-in-a-generation investment that would put the U.S. in a position to win the global war with China. The spending would be partially offset by raising taxes on businesses, but the scheme must be approved by Congress, and many Republicans, as we heard earlier in the program, are dead set against it, with some calling the tax rises a recipe for stagnation and decline. The plans have also roused fierce opposition among some Democrats, and correspondents say the pushback is a sign of the tough fight ahead for the plan in Congress. Well, for reaction from the Democratic side of the U.S. political divide, as well as from big business to Mr. Biden's infrastructure plan, which includes reimposing potentially heavy taxes on corporate America, I'm joined now by Joseph F. Gatt, a Democrat and owner of GF Solutions, which advises several large companies in the U.S. and overseas, and is in the telecoms and internet business worldwide. And Mr. Gatt joins me now from Great Falls, Virginia. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gatt, for joining us. So are you one of those Democrats who opposes the plan, or do you support it?
No, we support the plan. The infrastructure in the U.S. is in urgent need. And of course, there are a lot of neglected infrastructure programs. And it is time that we address it as technology changes, habits change, and population increases, and all the infrastructure are needed to accomplish all of this.
Sort of straddle both sides here, because you often vote Democrat and are seen as such, but you're also a businessman running big companies and likely to be affected by any corporate tax rises. So do you, for instance, share the position of powerful lobby groups such as the US Chamber of Commerce, who say they support investments but would oppose tax increases?
Well, any tax increases is opposed by most businessmen, but the infrastructure is not really geared to a Democrat or a Republican. It's geared to an American. It is, we all benefit from it. And of course, we applaud the action of President Biden in coming up with the infrastructure so early in his administration, which is badly needed. However, we have to be very careful, because these bills usually come in loaded with a lot of other things other than the intended purpose, which is the infrastructure. And I think there's a big requirement. There is a COVID-19 changed the habits of how business is conducted, how people go about in their business. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and now it's time to recuperate some of that as the COVID decreases on a daily basis. But it is needed. The infrastructure is needed and is very welcomed by the business community, because we all benefit from it. But we've got to keep away from adding things that have nothing to do with infrastructure. I mean, I agree with the program. The program, I think it's very wise, and I think it's a feather in the hat of President Biden to do it so early in his administration. And we're all for it. But let's see what the final details are. But we definitely will support it.
Well, that's a very interesting point you make there, because it sounds like what you're saying is that there is a chance that this could get even more massive than the $2.3 trillion that Mr. Biden is aiming for? Because, I mean, many Democrats in Congress, especially those from the far left, are probably going to be lining up to ensure their own priorities are funded in return for the bill getting their support in Congress.
True, but we also have to be careful that if the glass is full, another drop of water would probably overfill it. So we have to be careful on how we budget this thing. And, accumulating a lot of debt is only going to have our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren bear with the cost of it. So it is going to be a very delicate act in making sure that it's balanced properly, and it actually does produce the effect of the infrastructure that would benefit all, being the new energy producing systems that are underway and well underway, and we all welcome with that. And the roads, the fast transportation, and the population of the earth keeps growing and growing. So we've got to adhere to that systems and help the infrastructure and the benefit for all, including their own personal living conditions and others.
Well, I'm wondering, Mr. Gatt, I mean, when you talk to your Democrat friends, isn't it rather politically tricky for President Biden to have gone in this particular direction so soon after narrowly getting his COVID pandemic aid package through Congress? I mean, he could have gone in any number of different policy directions, couldn't he? Such as gun control, voting rights, immigration, the environmental health care reform, couldn't he? I mean, and given it a bit of time before coming up with another massive package.
True, but the infrastructure is badly needed. I mean, more neglect causes more problems. It's just like if you don't maintain the engines that are running, eventually they'll stop or they'll break down. So we've got to do it, and he took it all the way up front in his administration, and I think we have to applaud that. It is a very urgent need, and there are other programs that have other needs and requirements and urgencies, but this one is a big one. It's probably the biggest one, and I think it's good to have it. It's only a 4-year term, so we've got to get as much done as possible within that 4 years.
I mean, without sounding facetious, I wonder if you've got personal interest in it, because of course your company deals with the internet and telecoms and all of that, and the internet is a big area where he's planning to do a massive upgrade.
Correct. In the States, we're always interested in that, and my particular line of work is really working in Africa, and Africa needs it even more, and we try to bring them up to date as much as possible, both in logistical support and infrastructure support in Africa, which is badly needed also. But in the US, we definitely will bid on internet and other work that will be available to the private sector.
Just briefly, because we're running out of time, given that there are some Democrats who are not entirely happy with every aspect of this infrastructure bill, will the challenge for Mr. Biden be how to keep the Democratic coalition together?
Well, we have to see what the bill really says as far as details is concerned. I think the Democrats that are unhappy, they're probably unhappy if the bill is not really focused just on infrastructure or a very small portion. You have to remember that the COVID bill that just passed had very little going to COVID,
right,
and the rest of it on other projects.
Okay,
And we don't
I'm
want
really
this-
sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Gatt, but we're out of time. Joseph Gatt is a Democrat there, and he's owner of GF Solutions, and he's talking to me from Virginia. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and the United States, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.